Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 71 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. My guest for this episode is Steve Monteiro. After serving in the U.S. Navy and working as a police officer, Steve spent more than 20 years as a special agent for the U.S. Secret Service, where he was a member of the Presidential Protective Division at the White House, among other assignments. After retiring from federal service, Steve found himself working on a unique assignment, which eventually turned into a years-long quest in one of the world's most dangerous places to locate, contact, and retrieve an Iraqi scientist who could potentially help prevent future biological weapons attacks on the United States. I invited Steve onto the podcast after reading his new book on the subject titled The Gray Bird of Baghdad, an ex-Secret Service agent's desperate mission to save an Iraqi scientist. It's a very interesting look at the difficulties overcome in finding one person among millions during the chaos of an ongoing war. After you finish listening to our discussion, if you want to learn more, you can download a free PDF copy of Chapter 1 of The Gray Bird of Baghdad using a link in the show notes of this episode, which Steve has very generously provided for all of my listeners. But before we dive into this story, I want to say a big thank you to everyone listening who is also supporting me on Patreon, including Aaron H. and Rennie R. Your monthly contributions there help me keep this podcast going week in and week out. As a way of thanking my patrons, I offer a lot of great freebies and promotions, including free and discounted books and products from the Spycraft 101 store. Patrons also get exclusive access to long-form articles of mine that aren't available anywhere else. If you haven't signed up for my Patreon yet, but you want to, just click the link in the show notes on whatever podcast platform you're listening to right now. Steve, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Justin. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm glad that we were able to connect. I haven't previously discussed the war in Iraq here on the podcast, surprisingly enough, so I'm glad the perfect opportunity came along to take a look at one very important operation right in the middle of it.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
So before you went to Iraq, I want to backtrack a little bit in your own career, your own life, and start off. Can you tell me a little bit about your path from the Navy into law enforcement and then into the Secret Service?
Sure. When I was young, I always had the bug to become a police officer. I think I got it from watching Westerns. I always rooted for the sheriff, I guess. And so from a very young age, I always had that. And it was kind of a bizarre case that really sealed the deal for me. When I was probably about 7 or 8 years old, my mother sent me to the laundromat to pick up some laundry. Our washing machine had broken. So I went up there to pick it up. It was the middle of the winter. It was pretty nasty outside. So I was coming back and I had these big bundles of laundry, too big. They were bigger than me. And I had slipped and dropped them and they were flying all over the place. And clothes were going everywhere. They were in the mud. There was snow. It was just a mess. And I just remember my mother's going to kill me. And I was half crying. I'm running over, around the street trying to pick up all this stuff and fold it. And then this car pulls up. And out steps these two big guys. And I looked up and all I saw were these big boots and jackets, and they were cops. And for the next half an hour, they helped me to retrieve all this laundry and fold it all up and put it in the car. They put me in the car. They drove me home. They took me back. And I remember my mother was looking out the window when I got in and she thought I got in some kind of trouble. So they brought me home. And after they left, I said, you know what? I want to become them. I want to do what they just did, help people. And I was just so impressed by that. And that's a true story. And that happened. That kind of set the bug for me. So when I got out of the Navy, I pursued that. And I was fortunate enough to become a police officer and a detective later. And that's what led me eventually to the Secret Service.
Wow, that's a fantastic story. I bet those guys had no idea the long-term impact that little act of kindness would have.
I guess they did not, but it certainly had an impression on me.
Yeah, I can tell. That's fantastic. So once you made it into the Secret Service, what kind of assignments did you have? I know that we already mentioned in the intro the protective detail there. Can you talk a little bit more about your career with them?
Absolutely. So when I got assigned, I was assigned to the Boston field office. We have field offices all over the country and actually all over the world. So I was chosen for the Boston field office. So when I got there, I was assigned initially to the fraud squad. So we did a lot of government check types of investigations. So basically the Secret Service is responsible for investigating any violations of our payment system. So anything that has to do with economics and the payment system in the U.S. falls under the purview of the Secret Service. So I moved within a bunch of different squads. When I was in the Boston office, I was in the counterfeit squad, and you do a whole myriad of different types of investigations. So it's a pretty broad swath. And then I was also a polygraph examiner, which was a really, really cool assignment. So I did that for several years and wound up doing hundreds of polygraph examinations within the United States and outside of the country as well, into a variety of different crimes, from murder cases to crooked lawyers and crooked cops and organized crime cases and threats against the president. So it was just a myriad of different things. So it was a really great opportunity to get involved in some really good investigations.
Okay. So that's a lot more investigative work, it sounds like, than most people kind of think of when they think of the Secret Service, I guess. So you had quite a deep background in finding people and dealing with people and learning about them, that sort of thing, I take it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one thing that, some people know about it, but, they typically associate Secret Service agents with the protection of the president, sunglasses and the earpieces. But in actuality, the Secret Service is a criminal investigative agency who also has protection of our leaders as part of their responsibilities. And that's been that way since our creation. Actually, we were created in 1865 as one of the last official acts that President Lincoln put into play before he was assassinated, was the creation of the Secret Service. And the reason that he did that was there was no investigative agency within the federal government. And at that time, counterfeiting was rampant. It was estimated that there was probably 1/3 of all the currency in circulation was counterfeit. It basically was something that was going to bring our country, from an economic standpoint of view, down on our knees. So we needed to wipe that out. So the Secret Service was created, and it was put in the Department of Treasury for that purpose. And again, this was pre-FBI and everything else. So we were the first federal criminal investigative agency within the government. And protection came on later on as part of those responsibilities.
Okay, I see. Yeah, that's a very unique kind of dual role for an agency, I would think, but you've maintained it so well over 100 years now, over 150 years now, I guess.
Sure.
It's very interesting.
Sure.
So
it is good. I'm sorry, Jed. Go ahead, please.
So you did spend a little bit of time on the protective detail as well, you said?
I did. So at the time I was in, you had to probably spend about maybe anywhere from 7 to 9 years in a field office and kind of honing your skills, because you're also doing protective assignments while you're in the field office. You're assisting other agents that are coming into town that are on the president's detail. So you do protective work, but they probably like you to have about anywhere from 7 to 9 years of experience before they would even think about assigning you to the presidential detail or any protective detail for that matter. So when it was my turn, after I spent about 8 years in the Boston field office, I actually got assigned to our intelligence division in Washington, D.C., and I was responsible for intelligence activities in sub-Saharan Africa and in South America. So I did that for a couple of years, and then eventually I got the call to go over to the president's detail.
Very cool. Can you just talk a little bit about that? I know it's really not the focus of your book by any means, but this is the only chance I'll probably ever get to hear about it.
Sure thing. Yeah, so I got assigned to the president's detail. President Clinton was in office at that time, and it was just, amazing opportunity. One of my colleagues often said that being on the president's detail is like standing next to history. And it is, because you just, you're there when some significant things happen, and you're right in the middle of a lot of this stuff. And so when I was there, it was kind of a whirlwind, because President Clinton didn't like to stay in the White House at all. So we were always on the road. I think I've been to 60 countries and all over through the United States. And so it was a lot of activity, a lot of just interesting things that were going on. Now, there's a double-edged sword to that, Justin, as I'm sure you can guess. It can be tough on the family life because you're gone a lot. And I was married with children at the time, so young children at the time. So yes, it was a little bit tough in that regard, but it was just a great experience to be there.
Yeah, I can imagine, just like you said, being right there, ringside seat to history every day. It seems like it would also be one of the most stressful jobs imaginable, because you can truly never let your guard down, in the most literal sense of the word. So was it kind of like every shift was exhausting kind of responsibility?
Yes, there was a lot of tension, a lot of stress comes with that because you don't want to be the one that messes up, right? Any kind of screw up or mess up, could make the national news in a heartbeat, or world news for that matter. So there was a lot of pressure on you to make sure you did everything right. It was kind of interesting, when we'd go out and do advances, so that what that means is you go ahead of the president and you're out there working, and you're working with the local police, intelligence agencies, military, whatever, to prepare for the visit of the president. You would literally work like 20-hour days, and then the other 4 hours you would be in your room looking at the ceiling wondering what you missed. So it was that kind of pressure. And so it was a great relief when the president left your jurisdiction and he got back on Air Force One and took off, and now he's someone else's issue. So you had that great relief that nothing happened while you were responsible for it. So yeah, there was a lot of pressure.
I can imagine. I can certainly imagine that. All of this, do you feel like you came out of the Secret Service as a very well-rounded person, or primarily as an investigator, or something else?
No, I would have to say well-rounded, because again, you're dealing with so many different people. Like, for example, we did a lot of overseas stuff. So when you go overseas, you're dealing with embassy people, you're dealing with host country people. I would deal with the military of whatever country I was dealing with, or we were visiting, or the intelligence services, the local police. You're just interacting with so many different people, and you learn to be really good at getting cooperation and making sure that you get the things that you need. And so I would have to say you came out of this completely well-rounded, not only in protective responsibilities, investigative, but just as an individual and as a person, because you just dealt with so many different cultures and so many different people. It was really an eye-opening experience, and one that I loved.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's unforgettable stuff, I'm certain of it. So your book, going back to the book, because it opens with some really shocking, almost jaw-dropping, I would say, scenes. I know that you were there on the ground at Ground Zero after the September 11th attacks, while you were still with the Secret Service. So can you tell us what you were doing there in New York after that, and how that affected you?
Sure. Obviously, Ground Zero was something that affected, us as a nation. It was just an overwhelming experience, and something that I hope that we never have to experience again. But we were sent up to Ground Zero because basically it was a terrorist act and it was a federal crime scene. So having federal agents on the ground was important. So obviously we went up there with the intentions on having a rescue type of operation, but that quickly just didn't happen. Unfortunately, there was no one left to rescue. But it was a crime scene nonetheless, and it had to be processed. And I can tell you, Justin, when I first walked out there, it shook me to my core. It was just so overwhelming. It was 15 acres of just total devastation. I'd never experienced anything like it. You couldn't see anything. There were fires that were smoldering. It was police cars that were just crushed to the ground, fire trucks that were like no higher than my waist. They had been crushed. And, stories high of rubble and steel, and just, it was just a god-awful experience. When I first walked out there, it literally took my breath away. I thought it looked like a movie scene. It looked like a movie scene where there had been total destruction. It didn't even look real to me.
Yeah, it's truly hard to imagine. I mean, I remember, I was deeply affected by it, even as someone hundreds of miles away, as was just about everybody there. So it's really hard for us to imagine being there with the smoke and the smells and living it every day like you must have. So you were there because it was a federal crime scene. Were you assigned to some sort of team that was gathering evidence, or was it just a matter of bringing in as many people as possible from everywhere that brought you there?
Well, as you remember, the fire department was devastated. They lost over 300 people. The police department lost over 100. So basically, it was all hands on deck to, at first, to hopefully dig through the rubble and find someone alive. But as I mentioned, that didn't happen. And then it was about recovery. It was about finding evidence. It was about processing it as a crime scene, looking for things that could help to identify anybody that was at the scene that may have perished. So there was a bunch of different reasons, obviously, for being there. So there was other federal agencies that were there as well, clearly the FBI, and there were ATF, and we just needed all the help we can get because it was just so overwhelming and so large of a crime scene. So yeah, our job was to basically process it, and we recovered lots of property, personal property, and sometimes remains. So yeah, that was all part of our responsibilities when we went up there.
Yeah, that's tough. It's really hard to put in the words, honestly. How long did you spend there at Ground Zero working?
So we were there working 12-hour shifts, which actually kind of turned out to be like 14-hour shifts. And I was there for over 2 weeks. And then you got relieved by another team because it was just hard to be there any longer than that because, you had to wear a mask and it was difficult to breathe and all of that stuff. So they relieved us after about 2.5 weeks or so when another team came up.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so did you wind up experiencing any of the long-term ill effects from your time there? Because I know that a lot of people did, unfortunately, afterwards.
Yeah, a lot of people did. As a matter of fact, there's more people that have been exposed from the attacks that died since then than died on that particular day. And unfortunately, the body count for 9/11 is still continuing as people perish from breathing in what they estimated to be over 2,500 contaminants in the air. It was basically poison air.
Wow.
So yeah, I paid a price for that, and I won't go into all the details. I guess I'm just a personal type of guy, but my hat goes out to those that are suffering right now. I'm okay, and those that perished, and I'm glad the government finally stepped up and recognized that they need to take care of these folks that sacrifice so much.
Yeah, I'm very glad to hear that is happening. But my gosh, it's just it's a wound that won't heal in so many ways, I'm afraid.
Oh God, that's exactly. I couldn't have put it any better way than that, Justin. It's a wound that it continues to stay open. Hopefully, we'll get past it in the sense that we'll learn from that and just be better prepared for it if it ever happens again, which I certainly hope it never does. But yeah, it's a wound that is still open, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's tough stuff. It's tough stuff to think about for all of us, I'm afraid. So you spoke very candidly in the book, and it was refreshing and really eye-opening as well about, you felt a very, very righteous and kind of deep anger at the people who had done it. And you kind of, at that time, you painted with a broad brush in a way that many of us did, I think. And it was refreshing, honestly, to see you be so honest about those feelings that you had at that time. And then, of course, as we've already mentioned, later on, you wind up deeply involved in the situation in Iraq and, got additional perspective on everything that happened. So how is it exactly that after you left the Secret Service, after your experiences there at Ground Zero, how did you wind up working on this very different assignment a few years later?
Yeah, that's kind of a strange story in and of itself, Justin. So when I retired for the Secret Service, obviously I was looking for other opportunities in the private sector. I got a call one day from a company called Booz Allen Hamilton, which is a large government consulting firm. They're an excellent company, excellent people. And so they called me in for an interview. So I was excited about it, and I went in, and they told me they were looking for someone with my skill set. So that was great. So far so good. The only problem was they couldn't tell me exactly what they wanted me to do. So I that was a little bit disconcerting. But then I figured out, well, it must be some kind of government program, or maybe even a classified program. That's probably why they can't get into it. So I went home and I discussed it with my wife, and I said, well, Booz Allen's a great company, so I'm going to go ahead and just jump into this. So I did. I kind of took a leap of faith, and I accepted the position without having any idea what I was supposed to do. So I would just tell your audience never to, jump into something on a leap of faith. And that's what wound up happening. And it wasn't until about a couple of weeks later, after I accepted the position and I was in place, that I actually found out what it is that they wanted me to do, or what it was they wanted me to do. I had gone to see the deputy director of the R&D section, and I remember specifically he bent down to this government safe and he opened it up and he took out this folder and said, go back to your desk and read this and it'll tell you what we want you to do. So I did, and I opened up the folder and started reading through it, and it was just so bizarre because I was excited, I had apprehension, and most of all, I was just like, wow, they want me to do what? And what it turned out to be was the assignment to find a missing Iraqi bioweapon scientist who had important information. We didn't know where he was. And of course, at that time, which was January of 2006, the war was raging on. So that made it a little bit more difficult. But that's how it came to pass.
Okay, this time you're with Booz Allen Hamilton, and you are working with the Department of Homeland Security. You said research and development. Is that
Yes, it
correct?
was a DHS, and it was a Science and Technology Directorate, and within that is a section called Research and Development. So that's where I was actually assigned. It was a government contract, and I was a support person for that particular contract. As I mentioned, I was given the specific assignment to find the scientist.
Okay. That's surprising to me that it would fall, or it was when I read the book, that it would fall to the Department of Homeland Security to locate a foreigner who is believed to be in a foreign country anyway. So why is it that it wound up with Homeland Security rather than any other agency or organization, to your knowledge?
That's exactly what I what I was asking when I was looking through the book. When I was looking through the binder at my desk, I'm like, why is this case here? This is bizarre. So that kind of led to my, just curiosity. And I never did really find out all the details of how it wound up on my desk or in that particular section. But I think it had to do with my boss, who was the director of the research and development. But I think she was a principal in trying to get the information that this scientist had, which would be very valuable to us. And somehow I think that it kind of fell to us because, as I mentioned, the war in Iraq was going on, and all the typical agencies that you would think that would do this were so busy and tied up with fighting this insurgency that they weren't expecting that this was one of the things that was just kind of left dangling out there. So she said, hey, this is important. We need to do it. If you guys are not doing it, we'll do it.
That actually makes perfect sense. Honestly, yeah, everybody else is so tasked out and spread thin at the time that, you guys grabbed the baton and ran with it, which is very good, very proactive move there. So
yeah, that's pretty much how it came to pass. It was bizarre. So it's kind of funny that you thought that. I was thinking that too when I was sitting at my desk.
Yeah, I gotcha. So they already had the assignment before you were even hired. So they went looking for somebody like you with this specific assignment already in mind.
Yeah, it was kind of funny because I later learned that there was an Army intel officer, had been in the Army, and he had big intel background, who was given this assignment at first. He wasn't, I guess, working out for them. He wasn't doing what they wanted. He wasn't moving fast enough. So they decided to get rid of him and then bring me on to move this project forward. I didn't know that at the time, but I found that out later because I had several meetings with this intel officer. He really wanted no part of this. He thought there was legal issues, there were jurisdictional issues. We're Homeland Security. What are we doing floating around other countries? He really didn't really want any part of it, so he didn't do much on it. So I think that's why they fired him.
Oh, okay, I see. So then they found you, and I guess you had more of the capacity, I guess, for seeing this through to the end.
Well, they were looking for someone else that could, pretty much operate independently, that had, experience in operating overseas, that, had investigative experience, because obviously we had to track this guy down. So finding people and doing all that type of work, so they brought me in and they gave me the case. And I had mixed feelings about it, because clearly whatever you wind up doing, you want to be successful at it, right? So I was like, boy, this. And initially I was floating on this alone. So I'm thinking, God, they can't expect me to do this by myself. There's no mention of a team. There's nobody else around here. And how am I going to make this thing successful? Because obviously I was working for Booz Allen. I wanted them to think that I could, I could be successful at this. So I had my doubts. And then there were some personal demons that I was carrying around with me from 9/11. I was still angry at what had happened and the death and destruction. And of course, we're at war with Iraq, and my brothers and sisters are coming home in flag draped coffins. So I wasn't a happy camper with anybody from that region. And you mentioned that, and that's in the book. And that's the way I felt. Now I've been assigned to find one and sort of make peace with them and get them to cooperate. So there was some inner demons and inner turmoil I was dealing with at that time. But you're a professional, so you put your feelings aside and you carry out your mission.
Right, absolutely. So let's talk about this scientist in particular. His name was Thamer, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
So why was he specifically so important to DHS and these other organizations at that time?
So Thamer was a microbiologist, and he was an expert at weaponizing anthrax. He had skills that we clearly needed to avail ourselves of. And at the time that I was given this, I didn't know all of the specific details because, as you know, in classified programs, you're only told what you need to know. So my job was to find him and bring him in. And so I later learned, some of the technical things that made him a valuable asset to us. But that came a little bit later. But that's basically what it was. He had information that could help us because we had suffered the largest biological attack in the United States history at the time, and we didn't know who was responsible for it. And Thamer was going to be a key player in helping us to understand that and protect ourselves against future attacks.
Okay, I see. So correct me if I'm wrong here, but it sounds like this was approached not as trying to like capture some sort of fugitive, because he would have been directly involved in WMDs, as you said, but trying to find somebody who could be a valuable asset, like help this guy, rescue him, rather than capture him. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's correct. There was a lot of other things that were going on at the time which made this assignment really, challenging. Of course, what happened with Thamer was he was arrested in June of 2003. And he was thrown in prison. He wasn't charged with any crime, but he was thrown in prison. And that's where he was beaten and tortured for information. And what had happened was our rationale for invading Iraq was that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction that could affect everyone in the world, and he needed to be stopped. That was our rationale. That's what George Bush had put forward. That's what the intel was telling us. As it turns out, that was not the case. There were no WMDs. So when we had invaded Iraq in March of 2003, there was a great deal of pressure to find these WMDs, especially when our soldiers started coming home. Injuries and deaths and the press was pretty brutal. And where were these WMDs? And so it was just a big news story and a tough thing for the administration because they couldn't find anything. That's what led to some of these scientists being arrested, being thrown in prison, and being, harshly and brutally treated for information because the pressure was on to find justification as to why our men and women are coming back in flag-draped coffins. And so the press was pretty brutal. So that's what led to all of this. So he was thrown in prison. But while he was in prison, he was visited by us because we were aware of his skill set. And we needed to speak with him. We needed to get his cooperation. But for reasons unknown to me, the cooperation and the help that we had promised him never materialized. When after 2.5 years in prison, he was released and no Americans came. And he was thrown into this horrible environment where all of these scientists and academics were being targeted by the jihadis. And literally hundreds of them were assassinated. And the reason that they were sought is the jihadis didn't want the new Iraqi government to be successful. They didn't want it to stand up. They thought it was going to be a puppet of the United States, so they wanted it to fail. And one of the strategies, other than the military strategy, was to wipe out the brain power within the country, right? If you don't want a new government to be successful, wipe out their brain power. And they made a serious attempt to do that with the assassination of literally hundreds of academics. So that caused Thamer to go underground and hide when he was released from prison because he clearly would have been targeted.
Wow. Okay. So we had him and we let him, we being the U.S. government had him and we let him go, and he took that opportunity to disappear just for his own physical safety and for his family's safety, I guess, right? And then...
That's correct. And he was kind of if you think about it, he had been thrown in prison, he had been harshly treated, and then, he'd been thrown out into the wolves, basically, and now had to kind of go underground. And if you can just only imagine, Justin, having to go underground and adopt disguises and move from place to place to stay alive in your own country. And that's what happened to him. Of course, at the time that he went underground is the time that I got assigned the case. So when I was brought on, he was already out and I didn't know where he was. So that's what made it a little bit more challenging.
Okay, I got you. What was the reason that he was released in the end? He was never put on any sort of a trial or anything. Did they just determine that he didn't have any information of value, or he had done his time, or something else?
No, they actually did determine that he had information of value. That's why he was visited, and there were, FBI agents had gone to see him and others as well. So for some reason, and in the fog of war and everything that was going on around there, it was just one of these things that he was just let go. And of course, when he was released, he was waiting for those Americans that came to visit him that had said, hey, listen, we'll be here, and you help us out, we'll help you, and we'll get you to the United States, and all of these other things were said. And of course, the day he was released, there were no Americans, and he had to wind up going underground.
Yeah, that's so bizarre. I mean, it does make sense what you said about the fog of war, with shifting priorities and people rotating in and out of country every few months and that sort of thing, and things kind of fall through the cracks. But this was very significant individual and a significant priority, for some people. And it is bizarre that he was found and contacted and promises were made, and then those people never arrived to make good on those promises or to take advantage of this guy that was right in front of him. That's very odd.
Yeah. Well, Justin, even on a good day, things go bad. So that it was one of those things that just took place. And again, I didn't never really found out what exactly happened, and nobody was going to stand up and say, hey, it was my fault.
Right.
That wasn't going to happen. So you press on and you just keep moving forward.
Mm-hmm. So his family, how did they survive while he was in prison for 2 years?
It was really tough, because the day he was taken, there was no phone call or message or anything. He just plain disappeared. He went to work one day and never came home. And so Iman, his wife, began to try to find out what had happened by calling colleagues and trying to figure out what had happened to her husband. Because again, at that time, there was so many killings and so many a lot of kidnappings were happening in the country as well. Some were for revenge, some were for money. So there was just a lot of chaos. I mean, the country's at war, the infrastructure is gone. So you can only imagine people were clamoring for food. The hospitals in Baghdad were overwhelmed. Just think about the chaos of war. So, he disappeared, and she didn't know whether he was dead or alive for 7 months. And so she had to carry on, and she got help from, obviously from her family and from her dad. And so, but it was tough, and she really proved to be a really strong woman to deal with all of that. And then she had to deal with the fact that once she did find out that he was alive, that he was imprisoned for 2.5 years. And then when he was released from prison, she had to deal with him taking off again to go underground.
You're here because you're fascinated by the Cold War. And now there's a fun and interactive way to introduce your family and friends to the topic. I'm talking about 15-Minute Cold War, a new strategy-based card game for up to 4 players. As one of the great powers during the Cold War, use your armed forces to attack opponents while defending yourself with military, scientific, and economic assets. There are also wild cards based on real events and people to keep things interesting. For example, how will Oleg Penkovsky weaken one side or strengthen another? Players don't have to know any history to start playing. Just learn the color codes and point values of each card. My 8-year-old daughter understood the game mechanics within a few minutes and has already won 2 rounds against her mom and I. There's also an expansion edition available for game nights of up to 8 players. Find it at 15mincoldwar.com. That's 15min coldwar.com. And make sure to follow at 15-Minute Cold War on Instagram. Yeah, what a tremendously difficult time that must have been for his family.
Oh, absolutely. And he had 3 children as well. And a lot of stuff was just, going on. And I can only imagine, how upset they were and not knowing where their father was or what would happen to him eventually and all of that. So yeah, there was just a lot of turmoil and a lot of heartache and a lot of courage on their part to keep going forward. So, Iman, his wife, was just an incredible woman.
Yeah, I can certainly imagine. Very strong of character and all that to hold everything together for so long and all that chaos.
Sure.
So you mentioned that you got started on this project in early 2006, but it actually lasted for years, right? Before the project was all wrapped up.
Yeah, it did. It went on, and that's another part of the storyline that we clearly had some people who didn't want us to succeed, individuals within the HSC, Homeland Security Council, that just didn't want us to have any part of a WMD scientist. And I didn't realize that at first. I know DC is a bureaucracy and things do take time. And so, but as this just kept going on and on, you're like, wait a minute, there's something a little bit more to the story here than just, the typical bureaucracy. There's someone that doesn't want this to happen. In the government, one agency can't come out and directly refuse to cooperate, right? That's just not done. But if they're not interested in helping you, then they'll they do what they call slow rolling you. And so that's what they did to us. They just slow rolled us. And at first, I just, well, again, bureaucracy, right? But after a while, I knew it was being deliberately done to us. And it was different things like, well, so-and-so couldn't make today's Homeland Security Council meeting, so we can't make any decisions. We're going to have to wait till he catches up. Or so-and-so is going to be replaced on the council, so we have to wait, give them a few weeks to catch up on all of our programs and so forth. So it just kept going on. And it became clear to me, later on why it was being done.
Man, what a waste of time. That's very unfortunate. Huge waste of resources, time, effort, everything. So what were some of the other obstacles, not in DC, so to speak, but actually what were the steps that you had to go through to locate him across the ocean in Iraq, in Syria, wherever he was at the time? How did you actually zero in on him?
Yeah, so that was basically, gumshoe work, right? So tracking down people that might know him, who might know a friend that might know a friend that might have a connection, because again, we didn't know where he was. So it was investigative work that took place over a longer period of time, and clearly, in a foreign country. So it was a little bit more challenging. But my biggest fear was that if we caught up with him, he might even want to talk with us. And I couldn't blame him after what had happened with him, happened to him. And so I'm thinking, we could go through this Herculean effort to find this scientist, and he could just tell us to go pound sand. And so that was always on my mind. But as far as the investigative steps, they were things that I would use just in tracking down a wanted fugitive in the United States, relatives, friends, things like that you can contact, for leads, and then putting out feelers. And of course, my big concern was that if I approached him too directly, would he think that we were trying to turn him back in? Because he was wanted by the new Iraqi government. There was a warrant for his arrest, and I never found out exactly what it was for, but maybe just association with the previous regime. They were locking up a lot of people that had worked for Saddam Hussein for different reasons. And so, he could certainly would have suspected us of doing something like that. But I don't know, again, what the reason was, but that kind of made it a little bit more complicated. But, but tracking him down was just a series of painstaking, turning the pages, looking up, again, contacts, information, places where he would have gone, people that he would have known, that type of thing. And eventually we kind of honed in on having developed people that knew him, that we gained their trust to use them as intermediaries to go out and reach for him. And that's how we eventually made contact.
Yeah, that's incredible. I can see how this all took such a long time to put together. And I can totally see why he would not want to talk to you because he had not had a whole lot of positive experiences with Americans up until that point.
That's correct. And at one point, he actually left to try to get out of the horrors of the war in Iraq at the time. And him and Iman actually ventured to the Syrian border and crossed into Syria. And they tried to get out through Syria. And they had gone to a whole bunch of different embassies and trying to get refugee status and things like that. And so they were there for 11 months. And I knew he had kind of disappeared because, all contacts and all contacts with associates had kind of dropped off. So I thought he might have made some kind of attempt to make a run for it. And that's what wound up happening. And so he was over there for almost 11 months. So that was, 11 months that I didn't really have any exact knowledge of where he was. And that kind of delayed things as well.
Sure. I can imagine. Eventually, though, I think you were able to get on the phone with him. You actually were able to call his cell phone, if I recall correctly, and he picked up and you kind of introduced yourself to him, didn't you?
When I figured out, hey, we've done everything that we can do, I've got to build up a trust with this guy. So after doing all the investigative stuff I needed to do, I wound up getting a number, and I decided from DCS I'm going to call this number. And I hoped that he wouldn't just hang up and have nothing to do with me, but he didn't. He just listened. He didn't offer much, but he just listened. And that was my first contact with him. And I explained to him who I was and that I needed to speak with him. But I didn't want to go too hard. And so it was a matter of building up trust. And because again, from what happened to him, I was very concerned that he would just want no part of us at that time.
Yeah, definitely a delicate stage of the entire operation right there. But it's good that he stayed on the phone with you at least, even if he was very guarded, of course. So how do you move once you have located him? How do you actually get over there, meet him face to face, and then, proceed from there to actually building that face to face trust?
Sure. So, once I made contact and I went to my boss and said, listen, I made contact with the guy. And by that time, I had some other guys that were helping me. I had a lieutenant colonel from the Marine Corps who had a temporary assignment over in Treasury doing Iraqi financial investigations. And I also had an agent from ICE or HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, as part of the team. So we got together and say we made contact with him. It sounds promising, but I can't use a 10,000-mile screwdriver to fix this. I need to go. And so Homeland Security, again, just gave us, they were reluctant. They just didn't want our group to have unfettered access to a weapons of mass destruction scientist. And I can go into that later. But so they kept the pressure up on us and the slow rolling. And finally, we just had to develop a different strategy. So what we did was we decided to go individually visit all of these supporting agencies, all these agencies that were part of the Homeland Security Council. And there was the Department of Justice, the federal, FBI, and other agencies that were part of it. And we went to them individually, and we basically had to kind of promise them that we wouldn't be stepping out of our lane. We wouldn't be getting into things that would make them uncomfortable. We'd only be talking about the technical things. And so we painstakingly visited every single one and got their support individually. And that turned out to be a better strategy. And then it still didn't move quickly. And then my boss, Dr. Maureen McCarthy, decided to drop the bomb. And it was a bomb. She arranged a meeting with the Secretary of Homeland Security, Michael Chertoff. So we were going to see a member of the president's cabinet directly. And that's just not done. You're skipping over a whole bunch of people. But we got the meeting. It was in a skiff. And I remember up in Nebraska Avenue, DHS headquarters, Dr. McCarthy and I went up there and we were waiting in the skiff, and in walks Chertoff. He's a big, tall guy. And he was with his deputy secretary, Michael Jackson, at the time. So they both walk in and say, okay, tell me what I need to know. So we began to tell him the reasons and why we want to do it. And at the end of this, we hoped that we would get his cooperation. And at the end, he stood up and said, he shook my hand and said, go get him. And so with that, we got enough ammo, I guess you could say. And finally, the Homeland Security Council had to relent, and we were off to Iraq.
Wow. Wow, that's fantastic. So, I mean, Iraq obviously is a very, very dangerous place. Did you have to call in more favors or anything like that to actually get out there and have a meeting, a rendezvous with Thamer?
As I mentioned, I had one of my team members, Jim Elseth, who's a great guy, and he was a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps. So he was so helpful because obviously we were operating in a military environment, our military base, and we needed their cooperation to some degree to help us. So he was good with that. And then Kevin Kelly, who was the HSI agent, he had been in Iraq before because it was a pretty good size federal presence, meaning federal agents in the country. And they were there for a variety of different reasons, to pick up intel, bust up criminal gangs. There was a lot of criminal activity going on. So the FBI was there in force, and so was the Secret Service. We had people there. So we were able to kind of put together this team to actually go in and help make this, snatch and grab basically operation once we were able to track him down and kind of vector him in. So that's what happened.
Wow, that must have been incredibly tense, having that meeting with him and finally seeing him face to face out there where anything can happen.
Yeah, it was. We didn't have the military support, so we had a couple of ramshackle SUVs and some M4s, a little extra ammo, and that was it. So we were kind of on our own because it would just been so much bureaucracy to get any kind of help, and we just needed to move really quickly, because when someone says, "Okay, I'll meet you," you can't delay that, and then they change their mind or something happens. And again, we were just worried about him getting kidnapped or snatched or something, so we had to move as quickly as possible. So just did our reconnoitering and picked a place that we thought was safe, and it was basically going to be a quick operation to grab him and snatch him out of his vehicle, throw him in ours, and beat feet back to the base, and then go from there. But that didn't all go to plan like nothing does. He gave us a description, but communications was a little tough, and Thamer's English was a little bit tough. So we wound up basically almost attacking this innocent guy who had the same kind of car that Thamer was supposed to be in, and it turned out to be the wrong guy.
Oh,
And
man.
yeah, so he was one scared Iraqi, but we were eventually able to kind of vector in where he really was and get him. And it's kind of funny because I'd been chasing this guy for 2 years, and we finally made the grab, and he was thrown in the back seat of the SUV, and I was up in the right front. And all I remember is grabbing the mirror, the rear view mirror, and just kind of tilting it to look back at him and going, okay, that's the guy. 2 years I've been chasing him. He's sitting right behind me. We didn't have any words at that time, but I just kept staring at him in that rear view mirror. And it was just kind of bizarre because his hair the name the Gray Bird of Baghdad came from the fact that when he was arrested, the military got on the radio and said, the Gray Bird is in the net. I guess that's the code that they had for him. And I think it was because his hair was gray. But by the time I found him, it was pretty much all white. So I remember looking at him, that kind of stuck out as this Iraqi with this just shock of white, snow white hair. I just kept staring at him the whole time as we went back to the base. It was a little bizarre.
Wow. So from there, was it like getting him onto flights back to the U.S. for debriefing? I mean, was that another difficult process for you?
They allowed us to go. They were still reluctant. So they allowed us to go for what we call a proffer. Okay. All right. You can go over there and meet with him and find out if he has information that's important. Not bring him back, but just find out. So part of our team was a gentleman who was a microbiologist that worked for DHS. So we brought him with us. He was the scientist that was going to be able to help to verify his information. And my job was to kind of verify whether he was BSing us or whether he was a good guy or a bad guy. So our first meeting with him wasn't to get him out of the country. It was to determine whether or not he had information that was valuable. So we took him to a safe house. We basically sweated him out. He held up to the test and he had information that was important. I didn't know it at the time. I thought things would move quickly, but after that first meeting, I didn't realize it, but I wouldn't see him again for 7 months.
Oh, wow. So 7 more months even after the proffer is made.
That's correct. That's
My gosh.
Because we had to go back to DC and convince them and provide the information. Finally, get to convince them that okay, he's got valuable information. But even that, Justin, was kind of bizarre because even when we were able to convince them that we needed to do this long-term scientific debrief, they basically said, okay, you got 30 days. You get him here and you bring him back to Iraq. So right then and there, I knew they don't want us around this guy at all. They're finally acquiescing to letting us do this, but in truth, they just didn't. They wanted this guy to go back to Iraq. End of story. So that's when I knew that this is, we're being held up and there's a reason for it. But we kept pressing forward. But that was what it was. You get him for 30 days, conduct a scientific debrief, get the information that we need, and then send him back. Which was a terrible way of doing business because this guy is risking his life to help us. He's helping a foreign country. He's putting himself in jeopardy because it was so bizarre because if you were out there on the street, these gangs of jihadis and criminal gangs, if they would stop you and if you were of the wrong tribe, they would execute you right there. They would grab your cell phone. If you had any number that was tied to the Americans, they would execute you right there in the street. So he took a big gamble in helping us, to squeeze him for the information and then send him back to this horrible environment where he could be killed was just something that didn't set right with me and the rest of us.
Yeah, I can see that totally. I mean, we've been sending this guy mixed messages, to put it mildly, from the very beginning with the arrest and the long-term detention and the empty promises from somebody else. And then, now we'll take you to the U.S., but bring you right back here. And meanwhile, he's got this target on his back from the jihadis, like you mentioned, and the Iraqi government is out to arrest him. So, it's hard to see what the advantage to talking to us is from his perspective at this point. So were you able to convince them at that point that he needed to come over and stay, or was there a lot more to it than that?
No, there was a lot more to it than that. So given the fact that they wanted us to do this and then take him right back, there's always risks coming in and out of the country. You get spotted or things could go bad. So, we thought, well, let's go up to Erbil, the northern province. The Kurds are still our friends, at least they were at that time. And we thought about bringing these debriefers, these scientists in to talk with him. I would just get him from Baghdad and bring him up to Erbil, in the northern province of Iraq. But then it was decided, well, it was just a lot more dangerous to bring all these scientists in than to bring one guy out. So we kept up our original plan to get him to the United States. And the whole time that we were here, it was 30 days. And so we, quickly began our debriefing and getting the information that we wanted. But the clock was ticking. Every day it went by, I was thinking, God, this is just not right. Over time, what happened to me, Justin, was that you're driven by the mission, right? This guy had information that could help us, help the United States, protect us. So that's the driving force. But over time, it turned into a personal thing, and I've always been very cautious throughout my career. I've had informants that when I was a detective, you never get involved personally in a case. It's kind of a professional rule. But over time, as I got to know him and spent more time with him, I realized, God, what happened to this guy was just horrible. He's in his country and he gets arrested, he gets thrown in prison, he gets beaten, he gets thrown out in this environment. And he's got to go underground in his own country. And I'm thinking, we owe this guy, so the personal side started to come in, and it became a little bit more of that for me. The mission, obviously, first, but then I got this other part of this case on me, which led to a lot of, stress and internal issues. And even within the team, that this wasn't right, that we needed, somebody to intervene to stop this from happening.
Yeah, I just cannot believe it's just one thing after another with this situation. I mean, in hindsight, when we all get to read your summary of the whole event, your book, it makes it very clear how important he is. But it's amazing all the hoops that had to be jumped through for something that seems like a real clear advantage and a real clear need to us from a national security perspective. So was there a turning point? Was it something that he did or something that you did or something the agency did that kind of turned this whole thing around eventually?
So we had him conducting this debrief, and, we were getting close to the 30 days, and I was planning on the logistics of, how to get him back to Iraq safely, because I just didn't, you just can't fly in commercially and then he'd get picked up. So we had to kind of figure that out. So while I was trying to do that, I was calling back to Washington, D.C., complaining about, God, this is, somebody's got to intervene. And my boss was all on it, and she started making phone calls. One day when it was pretty close to the end, I got a phone call and said he can stay. I was just so relieved. And so certainly was he, because he was hoping that he could get a second chance and create a new life. So he was very relieved by that. But it went right down to the wire. I mean, we had like maybe a couple of days before we had to get him back.
Wow, but really cutting it close there, no doubt about it.
Well, that's the way the case started. So I expected, this is the way it's going to go all the way through the end.
Yeah, I can see that for sure. So then after that, I mean, there's still the matter of his family who did not come over with him for the debriefing. Of course, so were you involved in getting the family out as well?
After a period of time and he was allowed to stay, he was my assignment at that point. So we had, brought him into the DC area, and my job was to, maintain liaison with him and, do everything, find a place to stay and just, acclimate him to, the United States and continue to get his cooperation as we started to prepare the information that he gave us, which was actually put into a classified report that I can't discuss. So all that was going on, but clearly, he was worried about his family, and I did my best to try to, change the topics, because there were bombings over there in the souks and the markets and so forth. And he was very concerned about his family being over there without him. So that was on his mind, but he never complained. He never just, I understand you're doing everything you can. He was just such a gentleman and just had this great personality that just would endear you to him. That's just the way he was. He never got angry. He never, regretted anything. He just had this way of looking at things that, things are meant to be. And he would always say, Inshallah, God wills it. That was his favorite statement. So, yeah, we kept that up. But I did realize that he couldn't exist like this without his family, and that despite the fact that it might be dangerous for him, he would probably want to go back, which I knew he would do. But so we tried to make the case to bring his family, but clearly we got some pushback on that, because it was like, hey, we're interested in him, not his wife and children. Which was true. He's the one that had the information. He's the one that we needed to deal with, and his wife and children weren't part of that. But that's just not the way things should be. So we continued that fight. Eventually, my boss, who was up in D.C. while I was, with Thamer, eventually prevailed, and I was sent back a third time to get his family out.
My gosh. My gosh, did that go well? I mean, did you have any problems with getting them all out as well?
No, no serious problems, but again, a lot of typical snafus. And right off the bat, Thamer spoke some English, so it was a little bit easier dealing with him. But at the time, his family spoke no English, so just the language barriers, and we had to get an interpreter. And Kay Marish was a PhD, and she was one of the UN weapons inspectors, and she was very valuable to us in working to translate a lot of what Thamer told us, technical information. So we were fortunate to get Kay to come with us on this third trip to get the family out because we needed that translation skills, and Kay volunteered to come with us. And that was great. And, Kay went on to do some great things in DHS, and she was awarded the highest medal in DHS for all of her work. And she's since passed, which was, very sad. But so we had Kay with us, that helped out. But, when you have one person you're trying to get out, you got three now. So that's triple the problem, right? So luckily nothing serious happened, just the typical snafus, but we were able to get the family out and bring them to the U.S.
It's fantastic. Fantastic. I'm sure that's bought a lot of capital with Thamer in the end. And of course, it did well for his family as well. I know that you mentioned a minute ago, Steve, that of course this information from Thamer went into a classified report, which is no surprise. But are you able to speak kind of in a broad sense about what was it that made him so valuable to the U.S. government?
So Thamer was, as I mentioned earlier, he led their anthrax program at El Hakam and produced a lot of biological agents. They were never used to my knowledge, but he was the primary biologist that led that program. So he was well versed in weaponizing things like anthrax. And so we needed to have an understanding of low-level production techniques. For example, how could a couple of terrorists that rented out an apartment in Hoboken, New Jersey, cook this up? What would be the telltale signs? What would be the signatures? What would be the things that we would look for? How would you go about making this outside of a laboratory, in the field, so to speak? Because at the time, we had someone running around the United States who was killing people with a biological agent, and we had no idea who it was. The Amerithrax investigation was one of the largest criminal investigations conducted by the federal government, and it was the largest biological attack in U.S. history, and still is today. So it was very concerning with us that we had an unknown person or persons, or maybe state-sponsored, that was in the United States that was weaponizing a biological agent. We had no idea who they were, where they were operating from, and what other biological agent might they be dealing with. This was anthrax, but could they weaponize tularemia or smallpox or any of the hemorrhagic fevers or any of the number of biological agents that are out there that are deadly? And so we were unprepared for any kind of biological attack. And the investigation took a long time, and it was never really completely solved. The person that they wound up arresting had killed himself before the trial. So I guess we've had none since, so I guess you can make that assumption. But officially, there was never anyone found guilty of that attack, which basically killed, I think it was about 11 people and sickened more. But they attempted to kill 2 senior government officials at the time as well. Mm-hmm. And Thamer was the key to understanding all that low-level production techniques that we needed to understand and know a lot better.
Wow. Okay. So I mean, with that perspective now, honestly, it makes it clear why it was absolutely worth a huge amount of effort and time to find this guy and to get him whatever he needed to get him to open up to us. And I take it that information that he provided was very useful in the end, was very valuable to the investigation and to our understanding of defending against this type of attack in the future.
Yes, as I mentioned, it's in a classified report, so I can't get into the details of it. But even if I did, it was very technical, and I'm not a scientist. So there were a number of experts that were brought in to actually conduct a debrief of Thamer, and they would be the ones that would really determine the value of it. But it was valuable information, and Thamer continued to work for us and help us when he was in the United States. So that went on for a number of years.
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah, that's fantastic. That's a good end to the saga anyway of finding Thamer. I think that it all worked out in the way that we had hoped for, it sounds like.
It's great. So Thamer and I, we still stay in contact, and he's thankful for having given an opportunity to, have a new life and get away from, at that time, was a horrible condition. So yeah, we're good friends. And it wasn't that long ago that we exchanged emails. I had spoken with him probably about a month ago now on the phone. And one of these days I plan to go and visit. But yeah, we're still good friends. And I got one of the biggest surprises when he told me that he and Iman now are U.S. citizens, and that was just a great ending to to this. To think that after all that he had been through, that he is now a proud United States citizen. That made my day.
Wow! Yeah, absolutely. That's amazing. That's quite a capstone to this story here, I think, especially after everything he went through. I guess you would say because of the U.S. government a number of years ago, and then providing this very valuable service, and then yeah, I mean, he certainly deserved it as much as anybody if he was able to help us hone in on this type of bioweapons production. So I guess he and the family are doing well now. They got citizenship. Is he working in some sort of scientific career now? Is he like a retired guy or
yeah?
what?
It's kind of interesting you mention that, because he just recently told me that he had retired. And I congratulated him on his great career and helping us. So he was working for one of our national labs, providing training and other things. And so, yeah, and he just decided that it was time to retire and take it easy. So I told him, well, you've earned it and good luck. So that was wonderful news.
Wow, that's fantastic. What a story there. What a journey that all of you are on together for so many years there.
Yeah, it was an interesting journey, and it just had so many twists and turns. At the end of all this, I said, I think this might be a story that people might be interested in. It's a human interest story and all of that. So I decided to write about it, and I'm glad I did. It was great to kind of put the whole thing on paper and, just come to terms with all the stuff that had happened. And I just hope that people reading the story just can understand, our involvement in these long-term wars that just don't seem to get us anywhere, and all of the innocent people that wind up suffering because of it, and maybe make us rethink our strategies. I'm a patriot 100%, but we need to find other ways, I think, hopefully more peaceful ways to coexist.
Yeah. Now that you mentioned that, it really the story of Thamer and yourself is in some ways kind of a microcosm for what happened, because it was drawn out for a very long time because of a lot of bureaucratic wrangling and people not all working towards the same purpose, having their own, priorities that were not all aligned by any means. And it led to, tremendous complications in the end for everyone involved. I'm really glad that you wrote this, and I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to read it, and now that we can share it with the listeners as well.
Sure. Absolutely. And thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a fantastic read. I mean, I finished it in, I think, maybe 3 days or so. And I know it took a lot longer than that for you to write it, but I was able to read it pretty quickly there once I got started, Steve. So, yeah, thank you. It was very great read.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
So what are you up to now? Are you fully retired, or do you have some other project that you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, so I retired, but I still kind of act as a consultant from time to time, do some things. But for the most part, I'm sort of busy with the book, and I've get it out there and do some things. I've been invited out to the National Security Forum in Reno, Nevada to speak to them. And they're a bunch of experts that get together to discuss national security issues. And so they invited me out to talk about issues involving national security, and of course they're interested in hearing about this particular story as well. So I have that, and I have a bunch of other things going on and some other stuff. So I'm staying busy, so it's good.
Very cool. Yeah. I'm glad to hear it. Do you think you have another book in you after this, or is this the one that you wanted to get out?
Well, it's the one that I wanted to get out because I thought it just had so many interesting elements to it. But yeah, no, I've been thinking about another book, and I'm talking to friends and stuff and kicking around different ideas. So I have an idea for something else to write about it that I was involved in. And as I mentioned to you, I was a polygraph examiner, so that was a whole litany of interesting cases and things that went on within that program. And so I thought about maybe perhaps writing about that, just talking about some of these interesting things that took place with not only myself, but my colleagues involved with the use of the polygraph. And I kind of have a working title. It's called Don't Lie to Me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Like so, yeah, I might be kicking around with that and kind of outline it and see where that goes. But
Good. That's interesting. Now that I think about it, I don't think I've ever read an account or a biography from a polygraph examiner. So that would provide some, much needed perspective, because there probably is one out there somewhere, but I'm not aware of it if it is. So I think a lot of people would be very interested in that.
Yeah, I think, the whole issue of what they call a lie detector machine, which is not entirely true and accurate, I think might be interesting, and how we use these investigative tools to help us in some of the really bizarre and interesting cases that we worked in using this, and some of the different things and techniques that are employed. I think people will find it really, really interesting, without giving away any of the secrets. But I think so I've been kicking around that idea. We'll see how it develops.
Okay, fantastic. Well, maybe a couple of years from now, I'll be able to invite you back on to talk about that one as well. That'd be great.
I hope so. I enjoyed
Okay.
I enjoy your program. I've listened to some of your podcasts, and some of the really, really interesting things. So kudos to you to bring out some of this interesting stories. The last one I listened to was Jim Nicholson and his son, and I was just fascinated by that story. It was so bizarre.
Yes, that was a good episode. I was looking forward to that one for a very long time. That's the case with so many of mine. It's 6 months or more often before I can actually sit down with an author, from the moment I want to, from the moment I find their contact information until we actually sit down and record. So
So
the
you
anticipation always builds for me a lot, honestly.
so you're telling me, Justin, you have bureaucracy within your
Well, it's a
Okay.
little bit of a dance. In the same way that you had to locate Thamer, I have to locate some of these people that don't seem to want to be found sometimes. But
I got it.
I end up getting
I'm
my
with
man
you.
more often than not.
I'm sure you do. Again, thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you have any kind of like a public facing website or social media or anything if my listeners want to connect with you after they hear this?
Absolutely. So I have a website. It's stephenphilipmontero.com. I know people are not going to be able to write all that down and spell my name correctly. So what I would encourage them to do is just Google the Gray Bird of Baghdad. The Gray Bird of Baghdad, and there's a ton of information that'll come up on me, on the book. It's available on Amazon and all the booksellers. And from there, you can find my website. Again, stephenphilipmontero.com. But if you Google the Gray Bird of Baghdad, you'll get all the information that you want. I'd love to hear from the listeners. If they have any questions or insights, they can contact me through my website.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Stephen. This has been really informative. I'm glad we could get together about this.
And yep, it's a sure thing.
All right, take care.
You too.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my pages on Instagram at Spycraft 101 and at cold.war.stamps. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.